Hello there. So today we're going to be wrapping up the inquiry project discussing the overall impact of this project on me and the experience and everything and what I've learned basically. So I decided to title this project Brain, the Soul Question because of some of the things that I had decided to examine in the beginning when we were writing up the proposal. So in the beginning, my guiding questions were written out as follows. So I had asked, what sociological functions and historical events guide human identity? How does one separate the universal humanness from an individual's identity? Where is the divide between mind and soul, and how does one define that, whether it was psychologically or sociologically, anthropologically? However one would examine that, how would you begin to define the difference between the brain and the soul? And so as I began reading my first book, which was Phi, that book really looked at this basically. So it looked at the brain and it began to analyze what the different functions of different parts of the brain are, and what, based on those functions, really, how does that define our humanness? And so I talked about that in my first submission, but since I didn't use a picture, I just want to go over that really quickly. So as you can see in this little diagram here, you have the cerebellum here, which controls a lot of the very primitive and the primal instinctual things like balance and coordination. Among other things, just basically your function, being able to be coherent, walking upright, all of that good stuff. And then you have vision up here back here in the occipital lobe, and then basically as you kind of travel forward, this becomes what we begin to define as more human functions. So intelligence and things of that nature come from this part, and here is where up here in the frontal lobe would be where we begin to define our emotions and things of that nature. Here in the temporal lobe, there's also some interesting stuff that goes on. So I talked about this. So I learned this from Phi and Human as well, which was my third book. So you've got like the amygdala here, which kind of looks at fear. And one of the articles that I read talked about how you could actually, in mice, they've begun to figure out how to eliminate the hormone that kind of causes fear there, and because fear is kind of a combination of negative memories, they've stopped the transmission between the hippocampus, which regulates memory, and the amygdala, which regulates emotions and fear, for example. And so if you can stop this synaptic connections between those, you would kind of stop processing fear. So that was a really interesting article that I read, and it kind of made me question how, if that can be stopped, then really where does that part of us come from, and like how human is that really if they were able to stop that. And so that was kind of cool to read, and kind of nerve-wracking a little bit, but it was interesting, of course. All right, and then. Right, so essentially basically what what Phi was talking about was, as you kind of expand further from this area and you go outwards and travel into here, which is the cerebral cortex up here, you begin to kind of look at things that define more human things, and specifically our consciousness, which Phi really defined as the ability to kind of be coherent and make decisions really on a more conscious scale. So making conscious choices, being aware of what was going on around you, and that kind of takes place up here. Whereas if individual was kind of brain dead up here, you could still have these functions like vision, and you could still potentially balance and have things like that going on, and not be, if this part was dead, then you wouldn't really be able to function as you wouldn't really be able to function at the human level. However, if your cerebellum was knocked out, or your occipital lobe, where you were kind of receive vision, if that was knocked out and this was still intact, so when people are in a vegetative state, if that were to happen, then they're still perfectly coherent. They're just not able to, they're understanding things, they're processing, they're just not able to kind of convey that because of the issues that go on over here. So moving on. That really made me think about, okay, so what was the evolutionary process that allowed us to be this way? And so when I looked at that, it was interesting because, okay, so my next book was A Mind So Rare, and it allowed me to kind of, that and actually Human quite a bit also looked at evolution, and like I talked about in one of my separate submissions, it really discussed how our minds have evolved from this stage up here in the old world monkeys and kind of traveling down into the Homo sapien branch over here. And this is kind of what our brains look like today. What parts have transformed and become more complex? And this is kind of a crude drawing, but if you can look at it here, like our brains have kind of developed more wrinkles, and that basically that's kind of done as it says here, based on the inner surface. So like basically the fissures over here allow us to kind of look at what parts are more complex. Well, I don't know if this was done intentionally in this drawing, but like basically this frontal part here in the human mind is kind of more complex than it is in these other drawings. And so that was kind of interesting to look at what parts have developed more quickly and how size kind of affects it. And so basically what Human talked about was the complexity of the brain is kind of a combination of both the size of the brain and also the brain's proportion to the body, as well as basically the synaptic connections that go on within, and how one part of the brain will kind of work with another part of the brain. So how your frontal lobe might work with your occipital lobe versus how it might do, how those parts of the brain might kind of connect with other animals to generate their consciousness, because other animals are considered conscious. Just the human consciousness is a little bit different. And so this is just an interesting chart. Now, one of the things that I think all three of my books talked about, but specifically Michael Gazzaniga's Human, it talked about split brain patients. So Phi kind of looked at this, giving an analogy of a slave and how this one mad scientist had figured out how to divide his patient's brain. But in a more realistic version of that, Mike Gazzaniga has actually done his own research with split brain patients. And so when I watched a video, Carda, to kind of get a better visual understanding of what he was talking about in the book, this is kind of what I found. And so it was interesting to see, he talked about, so when you have a split brain patient, so the brain, which basically means that the two sides of the brain aren't able to connect with one another. They aren't able to, so they're both functioning, but only one is really able to render its thoughts through speech, which would be the left brain. So for example, if you look at it over here, if this placard were to be placed in front of a patient, this person would, and you were to ask them, what do you see? The person would say ring, but with their left hand, they could still pick up a key here because it does say key as well, and with the right hand, they could still pick up the ring. And so while that's going on, they're able to, it's kind of interesting, and eventually some patients have been able to develop speech in their right brain, and so they're able to say key ring. But it takes a while longer for it to connect, so the brain will adapt in that case as well in some patients. And it's interesting to see that the left brain definitely has control over the right arm, which is why this arm is able to grasp things and work basically fully. So if you were to say grab whatever item, the right arm would be able to grab it. Or if you were to say make this shape with your right hand, so like make a fist, then it would be able to easily do that. But because the left brain only has so much control over the left arm, it would take a little bit longer for this to work because the connection doesn't really go all the way to the fingers, basically, to those extremities. And so that is something that happens in split brain patients, which is what Michael Gazzaniga talked about a lot. Also, another thing that I kind of wanted to discuss was, so in my original proposal, I talked about kind of social things and then mental things. So how does what's going on in our brain relate to what's going on in the world and kind of our interaction with society? How does a combination of those two things begin to define who we are as humans? And this, I didn't really get to delve into this as much, although Mind So Rare did talk about it a little bit. It discussed how but it didn't really talk about it much. It discussed how culture does play a part in how our brains function, and how, well, not necessarily how our brains function, but our brains function, and then there's also a part of it that looks at how we interact with the society around us and how that plays a part in our decision making. And so culture is a big part of that. So, but it didn't really go into how much. So if I were to do some more research, I think that that's what I would begin to look at. So look at more sociological and anthropological approaches to this type of research, because like there has to be some sort of bridge between cognitive sciences and socioanthropologic sciences in order to be able to kind of understand things fully. So I do hope to do that, but there is some connection between the two, and A Mind So Rare does begin to discuss that a little bit, and so that was good. And definitely anthropologists and sociologists are interested in looking at the brain and seeing how it receives interaction with others, because that does play a part in our decision making. And so that on the scale of from our evolutionary tracks as primates, or really just like maybe what hormones are triggered, things like that. But the books that I read, the research that I did so far didn't really delve much into that, but that was something that I was interested in. It does play a part, so I would look at it some more. Whoops. So where does the soul fall into all of this? I don't think we're really ever going to be at the point, and if we are, we're going to be there. We're not there yet, and obviously none of my books really discuss that, although Phi does kind of look at consciousness as the soul. You can't really prove the existence or the absence of the soul, and that doesn't necessarily matter. It really only matters what people think of it. And so that was kind of an interesting thing, and being able to kind of define what the soul is as opposed to what the brain is kind of something, I guess, at this point at least, we have to do as individuals. And so yeah, I found this picture and I thought it was pretty cool. It is definitely an abstract concept, what is the soul? But being able to understand what our brains do and how that affects how we behave as people, how our interactions with others shape how we behave as people, whether it's individually or as like humans at large, that kind of plays a part in our identities. And I guess that would be my personal conclusion from some of my research. That doesn't really go into my original guiding questions because I wasn't able to research those as much. But I did read about meditation because I was definitely interested in the effects of it as well. And I thought about in meditation, so one of the other articles I read, I can't quite remember the title, but one of the other articles I read talked about meditation, and honestly, meditation does have multiple repercussions in terms of like medicinally, spiritually, neurologically. Actually, so meditation has been in like contemplative sciences. It kind of bridges contemplative sciences and cognitive sciences, and so you're able to kind of bridge that gap and look at how it actually helps people like depressed patients or patients with cancers and things like that, being able to kind of calm themselves and center themselves. It helps them medicinally. Obviously, there are spiritual repercussions to it, being able to kind of calm down and center yourself. And apparently there's some new research going on that says that being able to meditate will help you kind of unlock parts of your brain and be able, so we only use a small percentage of our brains currently. It's like 18 or so percent, some people, and some people more or less. But being able to kind of make that stronger. And so I thought that was really cool. And here's the bibliography.